Welcome to the Liam Sheff Show on Truth Frequency Radio and UCY TV. In this hour, Ken Humphreys of Jesus Never Existed, JesusNeverExisted.com. I'm going to present the question, when was it written, this thing that we call the Bible? And we're going to start with a question about Paul. Here's Ken Humphreys on the Liam Sheff Show. Let's talk about dating the thing that the octopus that we call the Bible. It's got so many arms and so many sections. They're all written by different people. And tradition, a word that I would like to try to define as we go, talks about Paul being first. So maybe, Ken Humphreys, I can ask you to tell people what that means.
Okay, let me qualify what you just said, dating the Bible. Let's be clear, that's too big a topic for this evening. We're talking about dating the New Testament. Now, 27 books we're dealing with there, and about half of them are Paul's epistles. So, yeah. Now, why do people say they are the earliest? One of the anomalies we have, if we compare the epistles with the four Gospels and the book of Acts, is that they don't mention each other. So here is Paul writing letters, and he makes no reference to Gospels existing. And so it's reasonable to conclude, well, then he wrote before the Gospels came into existence. Now, the church has a tradition that Paul himself died in the persecution, so-called, of the Emperor Nero. Now, that had to be before the year 68. Therefore, Paul exits the scene at the end of the 60s. So there we have a cut-off date for Paul, and we all know that Paul supposedly entered the scene, the Jesus story, only after Jesus had gone and he witnessed the martyrdom of Stephen. And so that gives us a starting point for Paul, and therefore his letters have to fit in that small period of time according to the traditional view. And according to that traditional view, they allow Paul to make one or two of his journeys before he starts writing. So the epistles come in round about 50 and then are finished by perhaps 65. So that is our very tight window for the epistles written by Paul. So then we start to add on to that in terms of the traditional or orthodox chronology. Well, then the Gospels followed suit. And well, there are schools of thought, of course. Some believers try to get the Gospels very early. You know, I've even seen suggestions that maybe Mark was written in the 40s. In other words, within a few years of the crucifixion. That is a very much a minority view, even among believers. Most of them now will put the Gospels in the last decades of the first century. So if we put Mark, let's say, round about the Jewish war, maybe just before, maybe just after, that's in the year 66, 70, if we get Mark there, then people choose, for no really good reason other than the fact it's a round number, they give 10 years or so for circulation of Mark before Matthew appears, maybe another 10 years before Luke appears, and then towards the end of the century we have the Gospel of John. So that would be the traditional framework, plus or minus a few years, depending on whose opinion is being given, and that is the traditional view. However, there is
one pause. Let me try. That's so much information for the newbie. Now, Paul, we've just put Paul because there's a tradition that he had to have been, and I'll let you do it all in the however. But you said something about a martyrdom of Simon.
Yes, Stephen, rather, not Simon.
Sorry, Stephen.
According to the New Testament, the first Christian martyr was this chap called Stephen, who was not one of the original crew of Jesus, not one of the original disciples, but one of the new body of deacons that were appointed by the church. And it's he, rather than anybody else, who stands up for the Christian cause in front of the Jewish high priesthood, and doesn't talk about Christianity so much as the betrayal of the whole history of the Jewish prophets, how they were never believed and they were all persecuted. And he basically tells the Jews where they've all gone wrong. And they get angry with him, and it leads to his stoning. And the consequences then, according to the book of Acts, then this young man called Saul, later to be known as Paul, enters the scene as witnessing the stoning of Stephen. Now, so that's where he begins.
Now, where does the stoning of Stephen occur in any book? Which part of the Bible and which part of anybody else's history?
Well, it occurs only in the New Testament, only in the book of Acts. And of course, it occurs later when Christians are writing commentaries on the book of Acts. So the only source for this so-called event is the book of Acts.
Good. I just want to clear that up because, people listening would think, oh, well, this happened, and so it's reasonable to put Paul here. So there's a character, there are these epistles. The epistles never reference the Indiana Jones crusade of the book of Acts. To me, the book of Acts is the sort of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade of the Bible. You just get all your friends together, and, it's just, they all have the magical powers that Jesus had. Everybody's magical now. Jesus is gone, so everybody has Jesus powers. And they go on their way, and they have, whimsical adventures to prove how great they are.
Well, the book of Acts is probably the least worthy of all the documents there, because it is a complete mishmash and fantasy. It attempts to solve the problem which the early church had, of linking this Jesus pageant that they've put in the first part of the first century with the reality of a church in the second half of the second century. You've got to link that together somehow, and the Acts of the Apostles tells, it would like to suggest, tells the story of the formation of the early church. So that's where it comes in. It's a document to justify the existence of the church, and it also does a great deal in terms of harmonising different trends and hostile sects within Christianity. But we can come on to that. But that is the story, and that story really begins with the martyrdom of Stephen, because it's basically saying this is the first persecution of the church. So
right, so it doesn't appear in a history book. So when was the book? As far as anybody can tell, now we have this range of dates, and 50 is their traditional date, and like I like to say, tradition has it that Luke Skywalker is Darth Vader's son, so tradition has it that Paul wrote in the 50s. But let's talk about history now.
Well, okay, let's talk about history. Well, there's a great deal of ambiguity and uncertainty regarding Paul. Now, I think Paul is too good to be true. He's what does Robert Price calls him, the amazing colossal apostle, right? Actually, when you start looking at Paul and thinking who he's portrayed as, who he represents, what he does, he towers over everybody else, arguably over Jesus himself, because he is so much. He almost single-handedly writes most of Christian theology, at least in outline. He careers across the Eastern Mediterranean, not once but several times. He establishes churches here, there and everywhere. And he is this great evangelist, and yet he succeeds, as every true Christian would want to from this period. He lands up in Rome, where he suffers martyrdom. So it's the perfect story of a fantastic early Christian. That's the sort of founder you would want if you were trying to dream up the ideal apostle. Now, I don't actually believe anybody quite like Paul ever actually existed. That's the radical comment one has to make. Therefore, early dating of Paul gets to be very problematic. We really have to say, well, what we do have are the epistles. They're very real. That we do have copies of Paul, so-called Pauline letters. where do we date those?
And that's
what
the question. And I want to
people spend time working on. Yeah,
right. And I want to clarify that for the audience, because Christianity will have its way with you, because it will flood you and overwhelm you with stories. Well, we know that. Well, we know that. Well, we know that. Well, its tradition has. Well, we know that. No, wait a second. How do you know it? Where do the letters come from? So I've been digging and digging and digging, and your webpage is at Jesus-Never-Existed.com, and your book, Jesus Never Existed, are excellent resources for the historian, amateur or professional, to dig in. One of the names that comes up over and over again in both Christian, what they call apologetics, and again, I say the Christian word apologetics is their word for them explaining what they think. I think they have to apologize because their arguments are so bad, so that's why I think they've taken that word. But they admit, and you point out, and anybody else, and Robert Price points out, that right beneath Paul is another character, and that's who provides the letters, at least the first letters of Paul, even according to Polycarp, who is an historical figure who was one of the early church writers or plagiarists, or whatever you want to call them, forgers. Do you know who I'm referring to? The guy who's the first guy, the guy who comes and says, "Hey, look what I found! These letters of Paul."
Wait, are you referring to Marcion here? Are we already into Marcion?
Did I rush you?
Well, it depends on the audience and whether they can keep up with us. I would say, let's just make a point clear. With regard to Paul, or his early days as still a Jew called Saul, there is no secular evidence at all. Now, that is an important point to make, because with regard to Jesus, when you start saying, well, he didn't exist, people will point you to Tacitus, to Suetonius, they'll point you to Josephus and so on. They'll make pleas that, well, yes, there is a reference. Forget that all for a moment. When it comes to Paul, there is no other reference. And that's why this colossal character, so-called, who meets with kings of the Jews, Roman governors, emperors of, all this is mighty suspicious when you fact that nobody anywhere ever mentions this character. He's only found, within the pages of the New Testament.
And for the most part, he's found in letters that reference his own greatness, his own troubles with his member in trying to control his member, his own shame. It feels like sexual shame.
Yes.
A lot has been made of the fact that he seems to be a closeted homosexual who hates himself, but that's for maybe another discussion. But there's another thing that this isn't Paul writing this, because there's no Paul in history. There was no Saul who was a Pharisee. There's no identity of a very famous scourge of the Christians who then became a turncoat. That's not there.
No, this is, again, an important point. This so-called persecutor of the church, this is how Paul is portrayed. In the early pages of the New Testament, Paul persecutes the church. Having witnessed the stoning of Stephen, he went on to get the top job. This young man gets the top job persecuting the church, and goes to the high priest and says, let me go and get the Christians up in Damascus. And off he goes to persecute and drag back the Christians of Damascus. But of course we know on the way he encountered Jesus and got his new mission statement.
But what do you mean now this is funny, because whoever wrote the story of Paul didn't have him meet Jesus. He had him meet a place in his head. I mean, Paul, for being the chief witness to Jesus, was a bad witness to Jesus.
Yeah.
He never met him.
Paul never met Jesus and makes no claim to have done so. In fact, his only encounter with Jesus, according to the book of Acts, it was on the road to Damascus. According to Paul's own epistles, he doesn't say anything about the road to Damascus. What he does say is God chose to reveal his son in me, right? Now, most people who study this don't actually think that refers to a road trip to Damascus. It simply means an inspiration in his own head that he felt he was getting a communication from the astral plane or somewhere. So Jesus spoke to him, it was revealed to him both in his mind and through his own reading of Scripture. So there's a mismatch there for a start. And what it all illustrates, to bring it into a nutshell, is none of this story stacks up as verifiable history. It makes a nice drama, because what does it prove? Why do they have this conversion thing for Paul anyway? Because it represents the conversion of a really bad Jew into a really good Christian. So he was, it's a theological point about conversion. The worst of the Jews, who was really good, a really good Jew, he boasts about how good a Jew he was, the really good Jew becomes the supreme example of being a good Christian. So it's a conversion story. That's why it's useful to the church.
And now, to be clear, again, this is the Liam Sheff Show with Ken Humphreys, author of the website and the books Jesus Never Existed, Jesus-Never-Existed.com. We're talking about Paul, the famous storied apostle, but he wasn't one of the disciples or apostles in what I call the Jesus novels or the Gospels. He's not there. He's not there at all. So he comes around much later and meets Jesus as the character in the story that we get has already been long dead, and somehow he comes to this one guy. That's not even in his own letters, but that's later put into the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade of the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, this very silly, very, very, very silly adventure yarn put in, as you say, to harmonize or to sort of draw in various threads from various stories and sell it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he doesn't actually meet the guy. He says he hears a voice in his head. It's a very contradictory story, because sometimes he can hear it or other people can hear it, and sometimes they can't, and he seems crazy, but that's fine. Then he takes a trip all around the Eastern Mediterranean to visit some real places. Now, you've gone to some of these places. You personally.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to them all, but of course places like Damascus are a little bit problematic at the moment. Yeah, I mean, obviously you can't see any evidence of Paul when you go to these places, and I'm sure many of your listeners may have done so. Also, what you do find when you go to these places, you find pious Christian groups praying at these places, because, of course, for them it represents something very holy. But if you take a secular view of these places, what in nearly all of them you become aware of is that there was never any presence of Christianity until the 4th century. That's the one thing that strikes you. After the 4th century, you begin to get the first Christian graveyards, you get the first Christian churches, right? But before the 4th century, all you see evidence of is a vibrant paganism. So it just shows you this whole mythology that Christians love to kid themselves about their faith sweeping over the world and everybody, people being everywhere converting to Christ. It really doesn't leave any residue in the historical record. So that's why it's useful to go to some of these places. It's also useful to see what later church invented. They invented, for example, if you go to let me see, a place in Malta, you can see where Paul was a column against which Paul was whipped. Now that was only chosen like 2 centuries ago to be the very place where he was whipped. So you can see how the church was very inventive in finding things that would inspire the faithful and strengthen their faith. So they've always done that, and it's quite entertaining to see these things that they've made.
It's as you say, Jesus land.
Yeah, Jesus land, exactly. And people will see what they want to see, of course. You go to a place like Philippi and you can see where the cell where Paul was imprisoned. Except that the archaeologists at Philippi will tell you that it wasn't a cell at all, it was a reservoir for the pagan temple, But, of course, in Christian eyes, they can see, well, that could be a prison cell, and that's where Paul was put. And so, they will kneel and pray at that particular spot and feel comforted by it.
Well, so none of this is there in the archaeological, historical record. This is a period of a voluminous writing about what was happening. You've got what's the author? Palkovich. Michael Palkovich pointed out that there are some 150 or 60 or something like that writers of various stripes and sorts in the ancient world, in and around the time of the fabled Ishu or Yeshua or Joshua or Jesus, whatever you want to call him. And none of them managed to so much as mention the magical being, let alone his magical servant who came later, Paul, who all theologians note is of two very distinct personalities, and you've noted it too. In the Acts of the Apostles, the Indiana Jones story where he has to get along with everybody, he's very nice and obliging and is a very sort of good sort of Robin to everybody else's Batman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you read Paul's own epistles, assuming for the moment they are Paul's own epistles, you get a very clear picture of somebody who's a bit of a theological bully and a bombastic, sort of charismatic, self-opinionated, self-assured sort of creature, and it's very different from the image you get of Paul in the Acts of Apostles, where he's very much the team player who's led rather than leads. And there is that mismatch, which, even apologists can't entirely square, no matter how creative they are. There is a mismatch there. In the same way, there's not even an agreement in Paul's movements. When God revealed his son to Paul, according to Paul, he went off to Arabia and back to Damascus. But according to Acts of Apostles, he escaped from Damascus and joined the guys in Jerusalem. So, the stories don't actually gel together at all well. But of course, what we should recognise about Paul, because we do have these epistles, is what they represent. And they represent the battleground of early Christianity. Early Christianity fought the various groups and sects and schools of opinion within Christianity. They fought each other through various documents, many of which were given the name or identity of Paul to give it authority. And so, we had, hence the epistles, and even widely now recognised that they're not all by Paul. There are later Catholic ones, for example. People will acknowledge, well, the Church wrote those. They are not really Paul. The Church wrote the Catholic epistles. And so, but you can see the whole body of that literature, which is a good chunk of the New Testament, is basically a theological battleground as to quite what to believe. And that's why within Paul there's an awful lot of contradictions.
Which gets to my question. When I look at something, in many ways I'm less interested in this story as to the model. I mean, call it almost a ruthlessly laboratory-based science. How do you know what you say you know? So the only thing that anybody really knows about this character called Paul is that there are scraps of papyrus or papyri left over, and there's an acknowledgement that the first letters of Paul came from an actual person, or somebody who's meant to be an actual person in history, who had an identity that wasn't magical, but that was very involved in theology. And that character was named Marcion of Sinope, which I think is in northern, on the Black Sea?
Yep.
So it's just around the corner. It's in the right area. And let me throw Marcion to you. And as far as anybody has been able to tell me, including the Catholic-managed pages in the Wikipedia, Marcion, fingers in the air making quotes, discovered the letters of Paul, and I don't have a perfect date, but somewhere in the 150s, somewhere around there.
Yeah, but around the mid-century, maybe 140, 150, somewhere in that time frame. It's difficult to be too precise. We know when Marcion was active. Now, when you come across Marcion, you discover quite an interesting character, and it sort of makes various bells ring in your head. You discover, well, he's supposedly a bishop from Sinope, as you say, on the Black Sea coast. His father was a bishop, so he's got even at that stage, he obviously came into the Christian fold at an early date. And you discover he was from a wealthy family of ship owners, and therefore had access to voyages around the Eastern Mediterranean. Makes you think, oh, who did that? Well, Marcion certainly could have done, being a ship owner, and he had his own take on what he believed Jesus represented, and his own theology, and he wrote it in a gospel which he presented in Rome. And since he sweetened the delivery of this gospel with some money, the church at first accepted it, but then decided he was beyond the acceptable limits of what they would believe, and so they split company and supposedly gave the money back. So he set up a separate church, which functioned by all accounts for 2 or 3 centuries, until driven out of existence in the days of austere orthodoxy. So an interesting character for sure, and particularly because of his attachment to the Apostle Paul, or what was said to be the original gospel, and it is the. I mean, we should perhaps state the major proposition here, which is that because this heretic, so-called, put together a gospel with several letters of Paul, as he said, here was a canon of material which the orthodoxy had to react against, and when they started to assemble their orthodox gospel, their New Testament, it was in reaction to Marcion. So that is the central proposition here, that the original New Testament was inspired, or if you like, a reaction against an earlier gospel from Marcion. So it began with a heresy in the lights of orthodoxy. It began with a heretic and then was a reaction to it. So that's where we're at. And of course, where we're at, now is in the 2nd century. We're not in the 1st century, we're in the 2nd century.
We're well into the middle of the hundreds. In case people wonder what 2nd and 1st century means, you always have to backdate it. So 1st century is 0 to 100, and 2nd century is 100 to 200. So we're in the mid-hundreds, and there's a fellow called Marcion. What's interesting, very interesting to me about his gospel, and he does write a Jesus novel, is that it's not a literalized novel. His Jesus is it's not the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, or the strange gospel of the strange novel of John. His Jesus is not only he's not materialized the same way. The story isn't there. The whole beginning and middle and ending that we have, where he's born to a virgin, that's not there. So it's a very kind of different conception of this character, who you achieve really through believing. It's more Gnostic in flavor, and of course, the letters of so-called Paul, or I'm just going to call the letters of Marcion maybe from now on, are more Gnostic in flavor. It's about what you believe and the experience that you have, and that's what you get in these letters of Paul. It's not that there needed to be a physicalized guy. You just believe it. You just believe it. You have the personal experience. Another interesting point in Marcionism is that Jesus isn't the son of Yahweh. This is really specific stuff. The Jewish religion doesn't have anything to do with Marcion's religion. Jesus is God, Father, is the God of a cosmos, but not the God who created the world. That was the old Jewish God. So Marcion's God is a different, unrelated deity, as far as I have it from Price, Robert Price. So he's saying that we're not stealing anything from the Jews. We don't need their gospel at all. We don't need their Torah, their Talmud. That's theirs. Our thing is ours. We don't have to resent them, as Justin the martyr later came to say. Those aren't yours. Those are ours. We're stealing your little novels. So this is a very different religion, and that religion is found in Paul. And one of the problems that the church reader, the people in the church who actually read this stuff, have is reconciling the fact that the Jesus novels, the Gospels, are very, very different from this Paul stuff. Well, Paul outnumbers the Jesus novels. I mean, the Jesus stories are very, very short. They don't take a long time to get from beginning to middle and end 4 times. It's not that much stuff when you look at the whole Bible.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's true. And of course, not all Christians warm to Paul. They find him difficult. They find him, not a terribly sympathetic sort of character. They prefer the simple stories of Jesus.
Welcome back to the Liam Sheff Show on UCY TV, Truth Frequency Radio, and wherever fine talk shows are sold. We're talking with Ken Humphreys of Jesus Never Existed, JesusNeverExisted.com, and the book about who wrote the Bible and when. Let's get back to the interview.
But you're absolutely right. There is this sort of mismatch there because, of course, one of the things that Christianity in the 2nd century is wrestling with is its relationship with Judaism and the Jews. Now it's very instructive that the most important thing that happened in the 1st century was not birth of any saviour god, but the fact that the Jews went to war with Rome and got totally smashed by it. And then you had another event in the early part of the 2nd century when the Jews again revolted and got smashed by it, and the Jewish kingdom was wiped off the map. So, these are events that cause people to start revising religion, and so you have to see this 2nd century as a period of turmoil and the explosion of multiple ideas about what Jesus could be and what he would represent and what he would say, and it's a battleground. There's no other way of putting it. It's a battleground for some sort of certain idea. Now the problem with Paul is, of course, one of the problems with Paul is Paul just got inspired from God. Now, if other people did that, you'd have chaos. If everybody said, oh, God's just spoken to me and this is what he's saying now. So that's why they had to domesticate Paul. They had to bring Paul into the fold and remind people that idea of getting the new messages from God, that's over now. Now we just accept. Now we have faith in what we've got. And so they had to solidify that story about Jesus. They had to have a definitive form. And that's why you've had these multiple revisions from the original Mark through Matthew's and a Judaizing version of Mark, and it's tidying it up and extended it. And then you had Luke's extension and changes again, and the extension into the Acts of the Apostle to make a more substantial product. And then, of course, they rather conveniently slot the epistles after those stories to almost infer that they come after all that has happened. But of course, they probably came into existence in absolutely the opposite direction.
Well, they did come to existence in the opposite direction, because in the mid-hundreds, Marcion finds, and there's a fellow called Polycarp who's working for the Roman version of the church, and probably writes some of the other letters of Paul, at least as per Robert Price, and I think that's good scholarship. But there's this overlap of Marcion and then the church in Rome. And the church in Rome, they don't have a central unifying document. They just probably have a lot of people who are following the idea of this Christos, this christened, risen Savior. They don't know what their theology is. They're all over the place. You have this historical character called Justin, who became Justin Martyr, who died in, 168, 170, something?
Yep.
Okay, so he comes along, and he's writing somewhere around the same time. Does he mention Paul?
Well, no, one of the interesting things is that he doesn't mention Paul. Paul, who seemingly towered so importantly in the early years, in the 1st century, disappears. People don't refer to him. I mean, this is the oddity. I mean, for someone who's this mighty apostle, he has to be rediscovered in the 2nd century. There's a very dark period, but that's a dark period about all kinds of things relating to the early church. The fable in the 1st century is one thing, but how the church emerges is another. I mean, you mentioned Rome. Yes, there was no church in Rome. There were a number of schools, competing schools of thought in Rome before there was a church of Rome. And nobody really knows who founded the church in Rome. They're just, traditions relating to Peter and Paul. But, that's so uncertain. But it is it all begins to crystallize towards the end of the 2nd century. Then you can have something you can identify as orthodoxy, and everybody who had a different view is then denounced as being a heretic who has strayed from the true path, which supposedly was clearly laid out from the very beginning. And this is where you can bring in your Polycarp, because there is a need to link the churches as they emerge under Catholic control with that story to give them legitimacy. How do you give them a legitimacy in terms of they can act as the spokesman for Jesus and the apostles? Well, the idea is you have to link them. You have to have a succession of bishops who have been appointed by their earlier bishops, who were themselves appointed by apostles. So here we have a link, and in that link, and it's quite interesting how the church fashions this link. They have Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, and they have Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, another church in Asia, right? These two together form the links of orthodoxy, so-called, right? And if you read the writings of these characters, the epistles of Ignatius on the one hand, and at least one epistle of Polycarp and his martyrdom, right, these people are Orthodox Catholics in the extreme. Now, in the sense that they are not profound thinkers, they don't have much to say. All they say over and over again is obey your bishops and beware of heretics. So it's a very strong line, repeated ad nauseum. But what jollies up the stories of both of them is, firstly, they both reign as bishops for the magical 40 years, and they both die martyrdoms. Right? They are both martyred for the church. So it's the perfect Christian biography. Now, when I come across any stories like that, it rings alarm bells in my head as to quite who they really were, if they were people at all. Because for all those 40 years in which they were supposedly illustrious bishops, there is not a word of their career, the progress of their church, or anything. Their story only really flowers when they're becoming imminently martyrs.
So let me stand corrected. Polycarp then is a figure. The number 40 appears so many times in the Bible. It's like people saying, a million now. Hey, I love, I love that. I do that a million times. Oh, let's do that a million. Whatever the number is in the culture, that means a whole hell of a lot.
That's what it is. Yeah, that's, of course.
40 goes through the Bible over and over and over again. 40 days, 40 nights, 40 days in the wilderness, 40 years wandering in the desert, 40, 40, 40. There's a U2 song called 40 because they were brainwashed by Catholicism.
Yeah.
So
sure.
Polycarp then is not a Roman. I'm wrong. I stand corrected. You say he's from Smyrna. Is that also Turkey?
Smyrna is today's Izmir. Yes, it's on the southwest coast of Turkey. It was obviously a Greek city in the period we're speaking of, and Polycarp was a Greek. I mean, you arguably you could say he was a Roman citizen. I don't know if he existed. That's possible, but he was a Greek. One episode relating to Polycarp that is in the literature is he went to Rome. Well, of course, that's what these would-be martyrs do. Of course, at some point they land up in Rome, and in Rome he seemingly had an argument with the reigning pope at the time, and then returned to Smyrna, where he had his wonderful martyrdom. So he not only lived up until a very great age, like 95 or something, but he then at that great age didn't just die. And bear in mind, most people died by the time they were 40. At this great age, he was martyred. Quite heroically as well.
Yeah, the story of his martyrdom, isn't it just riddled with sort of fictions like the fire wouldn't burn him, sort of things?
That's right. He had to be killed about 3 times to make sure he was really dead, yeah.
So probably not historically true. Does that appear in any Roman history?
No, of course not. No,
okay.
It's a church legend. I mean, by this stage, everyone should cotton on to the fact that an early Christian has to, if you like, tick certain boxes. And, and one of the things is, there's this life of righteous living, and always totally orthodox and Catholic, and certainly they end their days with this martyrdom in which they, and of course, if you read the martyrdom of Ignatius, it's a side-cracking yarn. I mean, really, this guy pleads for being martyred. He can't wait. It's like Christmas to him. He wants to, and he begs his friends not to rescue him. I mean, the whole thing is so ridiculous. So,
right.
In terms of transmission of documents, I know Robert Price does argue that Polycarp might well have been instrumental in writing them, and maybe the real Polycarp, if we could ever get near to him, maybe he did have a hand in there. But the one that we know of from the literature is as much a cartoon character as so many of the others.
Well said, well said. So Polycarp is also not, the Polycarp we receive is not the relation to any Polycarp, many fish who might have been in history. Let me just do what I do for a second for the audience. Look, there's a lot of names, but when you now go to watch these stupid Marvel comic movies, Ant-Man and the Avengers and all these other ridiculous things, well, these are very popular. And Captain America 1, 2, 3, whatever. When they show these movies, they love to take a character, a minor character from one movie, and put him in another. So now there's this movie called Deadpool. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about superheroes, it's because the same way that gods were written then is the same way gods are written now. It doesn't take much. There's a character called Deadpool, and he's in a movie, it's with Ryan Reynolds, and he's palling around with a couple of the X-Men. So we then feel the universe of Deadpool in our imaginary brains, in our imaginations, in our minds, expanding because we now relate that character to all these other adventures where we've seen the character called Colossus, who's in the Deadpool movie. So when you when you have a character in the ancient world and you're writing ancient world comic books, you're going to swap characters because you want to combine the universes a little bit. It's the same thing that they do to the kids going to these movies today. It's not any different. It's just basic process of storytelling. If you want to combine universes, you borrow. You have a crossover between the Transformers and the Marvel comic universe, and you're like, wow, how big is the universe now that it contains both of them? And they're thinking, wow, we got to get these people who follow this Pauline, this Marcionite code, where Jesus really isn't quite a manifested guy, and he never really quite dies either, because he's just barely manifested as a human, and his God isn't even the God of the Jews, so they don't even have any overlap. They just decided they didn't, and we're going to take that Paul and put him into our universe and grab those people. It works.
Yeah, I think it's a great analogy, Liam. It's absolutely true. I mean, the term I use is dreamscape. I mean, the Christians create a dreamscape, not only of places that didn't exist and things didn't happen there, but they create a dreamscape of characters who perform in this imaginary world. And it's all nicely tucked away so early in time that, nobody can really touch it or get close to it, and therefore, if you have faith, you just believe it. So it works. It's worked very successfully for 2,000 years.
Now let's date it a little more accurately. There are no letters or epistles of Paul. There's no Paul in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, hundreds, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s. By the 40s, you get Marcion, and then you get the first two letters. I don't know if one of them is Galatians, but you get the first two letters of Paul in the hands of Marcion. That's sort of agreed as an historical trope. Now, whether that's 100% or whatever, it's certainly agreed from an historical perspective that Marcion found or presented the letters of Paul with a collection of letters of Paul with his Marcionite story of the God who wasn't the son of the Jewish God. So, Paul... Yeah. So let's date it. Let's just date it.
Well, let's date it, but let's say a couple of things that we know now about the epistles, because some of them look like letters and most of them don't. Were they ever letters? Well, my point is I don't think any of them were ever really letters.
Right.
I mean, if you take say Romans, the Epistle to the Romans. I mean, what is it? 9,000 words. I mean, that's bigger than most books that we know of from the ancient world. Now, this is a guy who's an itinerant preacher. He's sort of working the people, as it were. Is he really going to sit down and write this massive tome, supposedly to a church that he's about to go and visit anyway? I mean, it doesn't add up. You don't have 9,000 word letters like that, let alone written to all the churches. I mean, the whole thing. They are not letters, right? But they might have been documents. Now, one thing one would have to say in favour of Paul, or at least somebody, because why were they called Pauline letters? Why did people want to attribute Paul as the author? And that's an interesting thing, there must have been. There's some theories there that it might have been a pen name, for the little, Paulus meaning the little. Therefore, it was someone being modest, and maybe it was Marcion being modest and attributing that name to it. But surely, it's at some point, certainly, you didn't just say this is a letter by, John or Jack or Jill. You just you actually gave it the name Paul, so it had some cachet to call it a Paul. So at some point, maybe there was some early charismatic evangelist somewhere. I don't know. We can't see that. There's no way of seeing that at the moment. Maybe it was just derived out of Marcion's own mind, in terms of just scripting an appropriate author for his words.
Maybe, and maybe it did mean little or diminutive, or maybe it was a rhyme, as in Josephus. You've pointed out that Paul was later historicized by borrowing from Joe. Joe gets borrowed from more than anybody for the writing of these Bible stories. Do you follow the part that I'm talking about?
Yeah, sure. Now, the other thing we should say, Liam, is that not only are they not letters, they are not simply one-off documents, in other words, written from beginning to end as is. We now know that they are composite documents, some of them composited from perhaps several letters in order to be the documents we know today as 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, and so on. It seems that it's pretty clear that at a certain stage, an editor has put together disparate documents and sewn them up and presented them as a letter. Now, so that again sort of undermines their claims to be authentic correspondence. They are statements of church doctrine, but that's because they are stitched together from multiple sources. That's why you have those disconnects and those contradictions even within the single so-called letter.
So the letters are themselves not letters. They're too long, and nobody would probably write a letter to a church. To the people of an area. You'd write it to a person. That's not done. It's unlikely. I mean, of course it's unlikely. So these are political dueling documents. They're almost like people putting out a statement on their blog, to whom it may concern.
Yeah, that's right. Plus the fact, as everybody should know, none of them are dated, and it's mighty difficult to use internal clues to date these documents.
No.
It's almost as if someone's gone through them to make sure there's no way of dating them. They remain surprisingly enigmatic in that sense.
And the historical clues, people, Christians are like, well, they mentioned this person, they mentioned that person, and I think that's called historical fiction. That's like saying that let's see, let me think of him. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was really filmed in the 1800s, because it's about the 18 or 17. So Christians were perfectly capable of writing historical fiction. There was an idea of history then that things had happened before, and then they might take an event as historical fiction writers do today and put it in. I call it the Forrest Gump effect, where you take a famous character and sort of digitally mask it into your silly movie to put your fictional character, to give it a little more verisimilitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. obviously we have to try and make progress with this material, and so that's why scholars, both orthodox and conservative and radical, study this material in order to extract some pointers to which betray the true time of writing, and to see where the joins have been made and expose them, and say, why did they say this at this particular time? Why are they attacking this particular heresy? When was this heresy around? Why would they have been attacking it? It must have been at that time. So you can work on these documents. But it's not. Certainty is not on offer, not at the moment. We certainly see the flaw. We can dismiss the orthodox story for sure. That doesn't add up in any direction at all. But there's still room for debate in terms of putting together what really did happen and when, simply because of the limitations on our sources.
Well, I'm going to quote something from one of your pages on. I'm not sure which page it is, but it's a first witness to these so-called Gospels. And Bart, you quote Bart Ehrman, who gets a lot right and plenty wrong. It is interesting that the first Christian commentary on any text of Scripture that we know about came from a so-called heretic, a 2nd century Gnostic named Heracleon, who wrote a commentary on the Gospel of John. 2nd century, again in the 100s. So, but the first scrap that anybody, I want to just try to nail this before I let you go. I want to try to nail down some dates loosely. We can throw out the 50s and the 70s. All of those are total inventions. There is no Gospel of Mark from the 70s. There is no papyrus of the Gospel of Mark from the 70s. There is no commentary on the Gospel of Mark from the 70s. There is no Paul from the 50s. We get Marcion handing over some letters of Paul. There would later be many letters of Paul that would be written. The church now has many pseudepigraphical. In other words, these are fakes. Letters, and they just are okay with that because that's the way they roll. They're fine as long as it represents their overall message, and that was the message of the church founders. Eusebius and some of the other church founders said it's perfectly fine to fake stuff because it sends the message. You have to know that that's what you're dealing with when you're dealing with the early Catholic Church. It's fine to fake it because we're here for the message. So we get Paul letters in the 150s. We get Justin Martyr writing about stories that he's heard, but they are different stories, or they're strong variations on what would later come to be recognized in our Jesus novels. You know, with John the Baptist, you know, sort of a vaguely or a more historical figure, bringing in the non-historical figure in to give him the crown, all that stuff. We're talking about the mid 100s for late 100s to this is the very productive time for, if you like, Christian story mongering. You know, certainly there's a whole body of literature in circulation then, and you can only imagine how it is in small snippets of stories circulate between one village and the next. And people modify it because, of course, all this is handwritten. Most people are illiterate. They have to be told these stories. So when a priest gets up and starts telling a story, he can add in his own bits, clarify this or amplify that. And so there's great fluidity in the whole tradition at this stage. You know, it's not fixed. It's not gospel. It manifestly is not gospel. How on earth could Matthew, for example, do such a job on Mark if it was regarded as gospel? It's up there for grabs and modification, and that is what they are doing, and I suppose what we should say really in the generalized sense, we're working back from the tradition that this whole body of literature was handed down from Christ to his apostles and then passed on to the bishops. It's all true. It's God's message. Believe it, have faith. You know, this whole thing necessitated making the gospel writers, so-called, into eyewitnesses, or as the church sometimes says now, near eyewitnesses, people around the scene. That is where they had to begin. It had nothing to do with historical validity. That's where they had to be. And so the whole tradition of New Testament dating has been tied and to this early dating nonsense, because that's the only way you can say, well,
well, these are eyewitness testimonies. Once you move that time interval out to a century or more, well, you know these stories are invented. Then, you know, you have sawn the legs off of the Christian claims. You know, if the story was invented in the 2nd century, it is not true. It may have a moral message, it may be useful, but, you know, it is just not history.
No, and that's the point for your famous rejoinder. It's not history.
It's not true. It's not history. It's more astounding rubbish.
From the New Testament. Ken Humphreys, I can't thank you enough for your time. If people want to find you and buy your book, can you tell them where they can look for you?
Oh, yeah. We're still flying high at JesusNeverExisted.com. The book has the same name. Easiest way of buying my book is from the website itself. Yep, come and see. Come and see.
It's a wonderful set of historical references. You know, as an historian or an amateur historian or a person in love with reading history and learning about the ancient world especially, I can tell you that what Christianity has done is to take actual history and take a thick layer of gesso paint, this white, you know, covering paint or icing, and just put it over it. And to remove that thick, disturbing varnish, and then to see the actual history there, to recognize there was a Marcion of Sinope, to recognize that there might have been somebody that these people that called themselves bishops, and it might have been pretty, you know, dodgy stuff. It might have not been, you know, so venerated as we think, but you know, later had an historical kernel there that somebody seized upon and wrote a much grander novel about, and then of course added the martyrdom after the necessitated Jewish number of 40 years, the Hebrew magic number of 40, that became the Christian magic number of 40. Well, go figure. These traditions travel together because, of course, they're coming from the same X-Men story. You know, these are all coming from the same comic book. And I think younger people, or people who have grown up in the era of Star Wars and Star Trek and Wolverine and X-Men, know how we tell stories. We don't tell stories differently now than we told them then. And if you look at how we tell fictions today, and interweave them and borrow from one from the other and take an historical figure and put it inside of a novel and expand it and really alter it, you'll begin to understand religion. And if you think that religion's magical, you're breaking a device that I call the mythometer. You know, and the mythometer demands that you adhere to the laws of physics, biology, and history. Ken Humphreys, I thank you so much for your work. You're really delightful. I love that you keep a sense of humor through this stuff. And I love your historical research. It's been forgive me, but it's been a revelation to me. I've been filling in some historical notes that, you know, I didn't even know were there. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the kind words. Thank you for the opportunity. I love talking about this stuff. I mean, actually, although we're dealing with basically a big lie, it's a fascinating lie. It's fascinating for me and probably for many people to actually understand what really happened and how we got where we are. But, yeah, it's been a great show, Liam, and I look forward to speaking with you on another occasion.
And we shall. You are listening to The Liam Sheff Show on UCY TV, Truth Frequency Radio, and wherever fine internet talk shows are sold. That was Ken Humphreys of Jesus Never Existed. JesusNeverExisted.com is his website, full of about 5 dozen very, very, very interesting, significant, research-heavy, but friendly articles, friendly in that you can sit down, read them, and I think understand a great deal about what he's talking about. Of course, many of the bits of information will only lead you deeper, and you'll have to take off on your own to find out who certain of these historical characters were. Religion isn't true. Religion is myth dressed up as history. People cling to it. It's one of the most unfortunate things about the human species, that we cannot decide to take religion less seriously. It would be good if we decided to take everything a little less seriously, including science. But we don't. You can see the problem of taking religion seriously if you just look at the history of the Western world, this Western project, always subdividing among creeds and then between different strong factions. Islam is, a pervasive force in Africa, and Christianity is a pervasive force in Europe and North America. The religions have much in common, and there are some differences. Islam is more fractious and a little more fundamentalist, but Christianity becomes fundamentalist pretty quickly. Just go to Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas. Go to anywhere in America outside of a major city, and you'll find fractious religion. See you in the next hour. We're going to have on more Jesus with Derek Murphy of Jesus-Potter, Harry Price. Hi, and welcome back to the Liam Sheff Show on UCY TV, Truth Frequency Radio. In the last hour, we had Ken Humphreys talking about Jesus and Paul, or Saul, or Marcion, and the reality of dating this thing that we call the New Testament. I said the Bible in the beginning. I meant the New Testament, and he corrected me. The Bible is, of course, much longer than the New Testament. That is, the Old Testament and the New Testament together. But the Old Testament, or the Torah, or Talmud, is much, much longer than the Jesus stories. Maybe because the Talmud and Torah were written over a long period of time by an actual tribal process of accruing information from Babylon and on. And the new stuff was more or less pulled together by committee. Wasn't really a history. It was a story of a super Jewish guy who would redeem the promise of Leviticus of keeping up the law so that the Jews wouldn't, be hated forever by the world, I guess, because they were chosen by Yahweh. But of course that didn't really work out because they kept suffering. So in a true fit of self-aggrandizing, self-fulfilling non-prophecy, they decided that their failure as a tribe really had more to do with the fact that their God didn't love them anymore. And so some groups of them wrote a story about how their God had a son and he came here, and now if you just believe in him, you'll be okay. The world doesn't really care very much about what we think or what we believe. The world cares very much about a couple of things. The first, in the material world of human beings, we care about oil, cheap, abundant oil. And when there's a lack of cheap, abundant oil, we can't keep minting plastic and destroying things to make the crap that we use to run this late 20th century project that we call America, parts of Europe, etc., where we can get anything we want, spend anything we want, and make anything we want out of plastic and mined debris, mined toxic metals, etc., to make into toys and household products and chemicals and pills. That oil is running low and getting expensive. Saudi Arabia has been in a nosedive of just constant pumping, along with the other OPEC nations, remaining oil pumping nations, as though they're trying to suicide the whole oil business. And maybe they are. which means that it's going to become a very difficult world for most of us, and I'm including myself in that, to live in, because we're not used to, and I mean used to, we don't have the infrastructure anymore to deal with a downed world economy. The other thing that the world relies on, though, is, something called nature. We don't really care about nature anymore, and we haven't for a long time. We just imagine we can make everything out of oil, and so if you can make a plastic something that looks like SpongeBob or any of his undersea friends, you don't really have to worry about the Pacific Ocean where all the plastic ends up. But of course that's not reality, because reality takes its cues from a larger connected, source, circuit than we understand, and that is the world outside our heads and outside of manufacturing. We're not comfortable with the world outside our heads and the world outside of manufacturing, and we imagine that we can create anything that we want, create our own reality, as people say, because we can create what's in our heads with plastic, with oil. When oil runs low, we'll be stuck with the remaining tools of the planet, the remaining resources of the planet that can be dug by hand, essentially, or by slow machine that probably runs on coal, or the more scarce remaining heavy oil and tar. It's going to be a messy century. Here's a little note. Before we get to our next guest, and in our next guest, I have an interview that I did with Derek Murphy of Jesus-Palooza, Harry Christ. He wrote the book, and I'll tell you about that in a second. It's very interesting. It's all about the mythologies underlying the Bible, and many ways to look at them. It's an historical look at some of the stories in that series of books. But before we get there, I just thought I would do something. I'd read a little story from Zero Hedge, submitted by Tyler Durden, which may or may not be a pen name, I'm not sure. I'm just going to read from this article quickly, because it tells you a little about the calamity as it's unfolding, the calamity that will be coming to us at a theater near you anytime soon. As you might have heard, commences the article, Sweden has a refugee problem. We've spent quite a bit of time documenting the country's trials and travails over the course of the last 12 months, during which time Sweden has taken on more than 160,000 asylum seekers. And you may say that's not a big deal, but for a large landmass, it's a small country. It's a small inhabitable area in a very, very, very cold, dark country most of the time. Last month, on the heels of reports from Germany that men of Arab and North African origin assaulted women in central Cologne during a New Year's Eve celebration, Swedish media alleged that police orchestrated a massive cover-up designed to keep a string of similar attacks that occurred at a youth festival in Stockholm's Kungsträdgården, or King Street Garden, last August from seeing the light of day. So those are alleged and reported. Meanwhile, a 22-year-old refugee center worker was stabbed to death by a Somali migrant at a shelter for asylum seekers at the Stockholm train station in Stockholm. And the Stockholm train station gangs of Moroccan migrant children reportedly spend their days attacking security personnel and accosting women, much like the Little Rascals did in their television programs. But it is to say that there are a lot of people there who are not part of the culture and don't really know where to be or how to be, and Sweden doesn't have any idea what to do. Sweden plans to deport some 80,000 of the refugees this year, but according to Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg, it may be too late to keep the country from collapsing. So concerned is she that she's now crafted an emergency law that will allow Norway to refuse asylum seekers at the border in the event it all breaks down in Sweden. Here's how the proposal is being presented by the anti-immigration Swedish online magazine Fria Tider. Norway is now preparing to denounce the Geneva Convention and to secure the border with Sweden by force without letting the people apply for asylum, without letting the people affected. Norway's Bar Association says the move would violate the country's international obligations as well as basic human rights, but Solberg isn't backing down. When we make such a proposal, we know that it is quite a big break for how things have been, but we must have some measures that are preparing for the worst-case scenarios. Yes, worst-case scenarios like what Sweden's Foreign Minister Margaret Wallström described last October when she said, most people feel that we cannot maintain a system where perhaps 190,000 people will arrive every year. In the long run, our system will collapse. Expect other countries to make similar threats as the international order breaks down amid the cascade of Mideast refugees. Once everyone's borders are closed, the question becomes this: will animosity push members of the member states in Merkel's Germany's harmonious union to the brink of war with one another? Now, any racist undertones, you're probably right, are there. But let's talk for just a very brief moment about that reality. I talked about those realities. The reality is that the United States and its allies have been warmongering in the Middle East for a long time to maintain a hold on oil. Because of that, people from those places are now fleeing, because they're fleeing to the most liberal, democratic, socialist European havens. They're as runaways with no income, no language skills there, totally different climate, environment, no home to speak of. Nevertheless, any problem, episode of violence or whatever is reported as reflecting the entire group of hundreds of thousands. Not quite fair. Nevertheless, there it is. And you'll see very quickly among the small-minded, or perhaps non-historically minded, a natural, perhaps tribal, guttural cry of some form of racism that will generally embed itself in an idea of Christianity or Islam. Christianity and Islam, both inventions of the human mind, both inventions of mythology, that are now considered some sort of historical fact. Christianity has no claim to historical fact. Islam has very little to no claim to historical fact, certainly not about the magical stuff. They're ways to manage and control people, and they seem to not work very well. But then when two groups of people who have different fake stories, myths, collide with each other, they tend to blame each other for not believing in the same myth. I just wanted to point that out. Now to the interview with Derek Murphy. A century ago, biblical criticism had revealed Jesus Christ to be almost entirely based on pre-existing mythology. Since then, conservative biblical scholars have regained the discipline and convinced the world that, whatever else Jesus was, he was undoubtedly historical. Jesus-Potter Harry Christ identifies the similarities between Jesus and Harry to demonstrate that both J.K. Rowling's magical series and the biblical Gospels are literary fiction based on ancient mythology and astrological symbolism. Discover the secrets that biblical scholars don't want you to know. A little about Derek Murphy. Interesting early life. A few terrifying episodes of childhood sleep paralysis started Derek Murphy down the path of self-exploration and the pursuit of spiritual wisdom. Thank God he woke up. He was paralyzed while he was asleep. After completing a dual major in philosophy and theology on the island of Malta, there's a religious hotspot, Derek had a crisis of faith when he realized that his knowledge of Christian origins and the literary nature of the Gospels had outgrown his Christian upbringing. If you're a regular listener to the show, the same will be happening to you. He began to travel the world, exploring diverse expressions of spirituality and researching religious mythology and cultural folklore in an attempt to pierce the experiential and psychological heart of religiosity. Living in Taiwan during his graduate studies in comparative literature, Derek became fascinated with the way that motifs from classical mythology and literature were recycled in the movies and pop culture, the mythology of our times. His master's thesis became the book Jesus-Potter Harry Christ, which has been translated into several languages. He's currently finishing his PhD thesis in the evolution of revolutionary heroism, the ethical inversion of Paradise Lost, and why Milton is responsible for our contemporary values. Let's bring on Derek Murphy. Who were the figures that prefigured and fed the myth? And I'm going to call it on the show. If you think that Jesus was a real person, that's okay. But let's talk about it from a mythic perspective, and let's talk about the figures that fed the story of Jesus as it was written down.
Mm-hmm. I don't think you can prove that Jesus wasn't a historical person, but I think you can prove that there are gods who were there before Jesus, and Jesus had the same magical characteristics, and if he had those same magical characteristics, like exactly identical word for word, then it's probable that the writers borrowed those qualifications from the previous gods. And if you take away all those qualifications, maybe there was still a historical figure, but what we call Jesus, who has, all of these traits, 90% of them came from all these other gods. And I think what the mistake, a lot of people will, when they do kind of bad scholarship and they just say, well, here's this 100 characteristics that fit all of these other gods like it was one universal story. I don't think that's true, because that can be debunked really easily. I think there's very unique gods, 10 or 12 or 20, that all had very unique characteristics, individual characteristics. Jesus is kind of the culmination of all of those, but they aren't necessarily the same as each other.
No. So let's talk about some of the ones that fed. You talk a lot about Gilgamesh in the story. Who's Gilgamesh, and where does his story come from, and how does it influence the Bible?
Gilgamesh, I believe, but I may be wrong about this, it's the first recorded story. It's the first major myth that got written down in several different places, so that we have fragments of the story from a lot of different areas. And on the surface, Gilgamesh doesn't have a lot in common with Jesus, although there are some cool parallels, like Gilgamesh goes out into the wilderness and finds kind of his partner mate, who's a animal type man. It's similar to Jesus going and finding John the Baptist first and starting the ministry. But Gilgamesh, like his story is not like Jesus, because he's not a savior, but he goes on a quest for immortality, and he goes to find this kind of plant, the tree of immortality that gives him eternal life, and he finds it by tracking down basically a prefigure to Noah. It's like Noah and his wife who survived the first flood and carried this eternal life-giving fruit. There's a lot of things, and it's just a cool story because there's so many things in the Gilgamesh epic that came before the Old Testament was written down. So there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that's really taken from this, I don't think it's Babylonian, I think it's Assyrian kind of literature. But there's passages and figures, like exact figures in cubits, that you can show very clearly which is the earlier literature and which had it right first, and where the Old Testament's copying from.
Well, right.
And so I start off with that one just to show, like, the Bible is already copying from this older mythology, like it's already happening, and there's very clear correlation. So just as a way to, show that this happens, that this did happen.
So we get Noah and the flood in a character called Utnapishtim, and we get the tree of life, the tree of immortality, and trees, crosses, and the trees of the Garden of Eden are all kind of figures that swap with each other. Jesus or Yeshua or Yehoshua, the various names that we now just round down to Jesus, or Jesus, my friend from Argentina, was killed on a tree in some versions. So being killed on a tree is a repeating motif, not on a cross, which was a Roman way to get rid of criminals. Then you move on to Dionysus. Dionysus you're right. Despite obvious similarities between Dionysus and Jesus, the wedding wine miracles and Jesus' statement about being the one true vine, these two figures may seem poles apart. What do you mean?
Well, what most people know about Dionysus is that he is this fertility god, like a party god, and especially it didn't come up to like Nietzsche, I think, who divided between the Dionysian mind and the Apolline mind. So most people's common understanding of Greek mythology is that, our rational brain is Apollo and our subconscious animal brain is Dionysus. So most people think of Dionysus as inspired madness or inebriation or, sex in the jungle, that kind of thing. So when you think of Jesus and Dionysus is more like a Satan character if you're comparing it to Christianity. There'd be the good and the bad kind of thing. But there's some neat stories the main story that got written down of Dionysus was, I think, Pentheus, who's a king. Dionysus is sweeping into this area, and this one king says, no, this is bad. We want ordered, rational society. Let's keep him out. And Dionysus kind of just makes a fool of him, turns him into a woman, ultimately like hangs him up on top of a tree, which I think is where we get like the angel of our Christmas trees, putting him on top of a tree. The Christmas tree is fascinating too, just because of the story. People will say, the contemporary Christians will say that the Christmas tree is all pagan. You need to get rid of the pagan Christmas tree and bring back Jesus. But I think Jesus was the same as Attis, and they're cutting, like every year they cut down the tree to bring it into the womb of the goddess so that it can be reborn again. I think Jesus is a what do you call it? He's like Attis. He's the thing that you put on the tree. He's the male that gets reborn every spring.
Well, let's talk about this quality. Dionysus is called the reborn god,
right?
The god man, God in disguise as a man. So, you want to jump ahead to Attis, or we're going to skip Pythagoras, and I want to come back to Pythagoras.
Okay.
And
there's different ones that are more similar than others. A lot of them are rebirth gods. So it's something about the death in the winter, and then the seeds get planted, and then the rejuvenation of the world. Several of the gods kind of fit into that, and then some of them maybe they weren't in the beginning, but they become that kind of god, a fertilization god, just because it's kind of the popular thing to do. I mean, it's a time when all these cultures are coming together for the first time, and they're all kind of trying to figure out what their god is and what he does. So they learn these traits that other foreign gods have, and they kind of invite them into their own practice.
So, here, reading from your book, in works of art, Attis is represented as a shepherd with a flute and staff, sometimes near or under a tree. The cult of Attis and Cybele became extremely popular in Greek and Roman society. You have to remember, and I'm just adding this, that there were entire civilizations that worshipped different gods, and we just sort of forget that. I mean, they actually had much longer histories than we do, and they worshipped different gods for longer periods. And then you write, and a public festival commemorating the death and rebirth of Attis was the first.
Yeah, and that was at least, I think, 300 BC in Rome. I think that's right. Where Rome was pretty open-minded about foreign gods, and it was popular enough to kind of say, okay, let's have a temple of Attis, and it was pretty widely practiced. And it was, the Attis is basically our Easter ritual, like the same way that it's practiced in Eastern Europe today, where they have the parades and they have the eggs that are like the eggs cooked in the bread. The way that they celebrated Attis 2,500 years ago is almost identical to the way they celebrate Jesus for most of the Easter pageants, especially Eastern Orthodoxy, but a lot of Europe too.
And if you want to talk about magical birth, the idea that, Mary, the young woman, was, who was later transmogrified into a virgin by an accident of translation.
Right, way later.
Yeah, way later. I mean, at first, she's just a nice Jewish girl with a nice Jewish husband, for some reason has to travel a long way on a donkey when she's just about to give birth. Doesn't make a lot of sense. You do cover, these histories and the problems with history, the problems with having a census at a particular time. This stuff is just really outrageous from an historical point of view. But let me read this line from your book. Attis was the consort or lover of the Phrygian mother goddess Cybele, whose cult, although ancient, was introduced to Rome around 200 BC. The addition of Attis into this cult, however, may have occurred later. The first literary reference to Attis is a poem by Catullus, Roman writer. The worship of Attis was primarily an annual celebration of his suffering, death, and rebirth, similar to Osiris, who I've talked about on the show before, but with notable differences. For example, its emphasis on castration. Now listen to this story. This is your book, Jesus, Potter, Harry, Christ, available on Amazon, and hopefully there'll be a subsection so people can just get just this chapter for less. Cybele rejected Zeus as a lover, but he spilled his semen on her while she was sleeping. virgin birth, spilling, and she gave birth to Aegisthus, a wild demon, who was so fearful the gods cut off his testicles to render him powerless. I mean, echoes of Samson and Hercules and all these other things. From the blood grew an almond tree. Nana, the daughter of the river goddess Sangarius, took an almond to her breast, or ate the fruit, from this tree, and 9 months later gave birth to Attis. Thus he was miraculously born, half divine. Gee, where do we get our ideas? Who's next in the list of gods that look like what? Who's Mithras?
He's later, and so a lot of people will say Mithras is the most similar to Jesus, so that's why a lot of Christ mythers will say Mithras is the same as Jesus, but then Christians will say Mithras came later. You can't prove that he came earlier. But what I think, I mean, this is almost the same time period, and all these gods are coming together, and Mithras was more of a, like taking all of these religions together, and then they also have a cult atmosphere where you're not indoctrinated, you're initiated into kind of a secret group. So there's nighttime ceremonies and rituals and probably some kind of a drug use, but where just like an amazing experience, and you're reborn, you come out like you're buried at night, and you come out as in a new life. There's different names for these different cults because they had different gods, but it was the same kind of practice, the same kind of ritual. But Mithras is more in the army, like in the Roman army. So it was commonly practiced in underground vaults. A lot of astrological symbolism. They always painted the vaults. You know, you're reborn through these 7 levels, the 7 layers in the heavens. Mithras is mostly, I talk a lot about astrology in the book, but Mithras is connected to the bull because he slay the bull. That was his big thing. And I say that Mithras is based on an older pattern of astrology where Taurus was more important, and then we shifted into Aries. So Jesus comes and kind of slays the lamb, except he is the lamb. So he's both, slaying on the cross, and he's also the slayer. Mm-hmm. And I say that Mithras has the sword. Like the sword was his symbol. So you had a sword symbol imprinted on the loaves of bread, and the sword probably signed on your forehead and stuff when you're initiated. Mm-hmm. But the sword symbol is really just the same as the cross symbol. So you have a sword killing the bull, and then you have the cross killing the lamb that represents Jesus. But like when you picture them, it's the same symbol. It's just different interpretation.
Absolutely, and your book has lovely pictures of the symbology. You're listening to the Liam Sheff Show. We're on with Derek Murphy, author of Jesus, Potter, Harry, Christ, and other books. We will be back in a moment with more. We will return with the second half of the interview with Derek Murphy of Jesus, Potter, Harry, Christ. Or is it Harry, Christ, Jesus, Potter? Either way. You can find his book at Amazon.com under Jesus, Potter. It's a great cover. He's very talented at that. He also writes books about being a writer and writing self-published books and how to interact with that complex system that will probably be collapsing in the next, couple of years. So that we'll all have to go back to local guild systems and stand in pubs and read our treaties and see if we can get any popular acclaim that way, if the local squire, chieftain, or duke will permit it. You think you've seen censorship. You haven't seen censorship till the return of the Middle Ages. Yes, it's radioactive Middle Ages coming your way, thanks to the American century. This is Liam Sheff. You can support this work. You can support interviews like the one that you heard with Ken Humphreys of Jesus Never Existed, the one that you're hearing with Derek Murphy. You can support my research into all the things that I talk about by going to Amazon.com and buying Official Stories by Liam Sheff. I'm working on the sequel, American Heretic, right now. Different sort of book, covers many nonfiction topics and explains why, in fact, they are fictions. Even the stories that we believe aren't true. They're myths right underneath the surface. Please support independent research, radio, and journalism by doing just that. You can also go to the PayPal page linked on this site, linked on my YouTube page, linked on Facebook, etc., and on my website, and put in $5, $10, or $20, whatever you can afford, for the pleasure of hearing radio interviews like this and the analysis that you really will only get here. Yes, religious, science, mythological understanding of the world, an understanding of the sciences of the world as really being held together by mythic beliefs. You don't find that in a lot of places. I've been on a lot of shows where people would agree with me with one thing very strongly, and they'd be surprised that I would turn around and say, yes, but this religion that you believe in isn't historical, or yes, this science that you believe in isn't absolutely true. So it's up to you to keep this kind of thing going. Please support by buying a book or donating a little bit in PayPal. Thanks very much. See you in a minute. Welcome back to the Liam Sheff Show on Truth Frequency Radio and UCY TV. We're talking with Derek Murphy of Jesus, Potter, Harry Christ, and other books. You can find him and his books on Amazon.com. Jesus, Potter, Harry Christ, the fascinating parallels between two of the world's most popular literary characters. During the interview, we are talking about the mythological structure underneath the supposedly literal Christian stories that were original in their time, except that they weren't. They were all taken from somewhere else. They were taken from the Torah, the Talmud, and then that stuff was taken from old Greek myths. So we're getting into that a little bit. We're going to talk more about that and the construction of the Bible, the construction of myths, and how Harry Potter fits into the equation. If you're enjoying the show, please contribute by buying one of Derek's books, support his work. You can also contribute to the show by buying Official Stories by Liam Sheff, that's me, on Amazon.com, or going to PayPal and donating a little bit so that I can keep writing my new book, American Heretic, which I will have done within the next 2 to 2.5 months. If you're on the West Coast, where the drought is and Fukushima is raining down, join me in figuring out where you're going to move. I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about permaculture, and we're going to be talking about that more on upcoming shows. How do we negotiate a world which may be very difficult to survive in? Something that we'll be talking about more and more, even as we talk about the fake sciences and the fake religions and the myths underneath it all. We're going to have to talk about real survival and reality. Let's get back to the interview with Derek Murphy. Hi, and welcome back to the Liam Sheff Show on UCY TV and Truth Frequency Radio. We're on with Derek Murphy, author of Jesus, Potter, Harry Christ, and other books, available on Amazon.com. We were just talking about Mitra and the astrological influence on our myth-making system. Well, of course there's astrological influence. This was the religion of the ancient human beings, that you look at the sky, you deal with the local technology, which is moving animals around, dealing with snakes and fish and goats and sheep and feeling the magic of the world. The idea that Jesus is associated with a lamb should tell you that he comes from a herding culture. The idea that Mithras is associated with a bull tells you he comes from a herding culture. The Minoans, did their bull jumping. They're associated with a herding culture, an animal breeding culture. Mithras, by the way, was, you said, popular among the Roman army. And when Constantine, I want to say, I'm going to get the date wrong. Was it in the
313 or something?
Thank you. In the 300s. When Constantine supposedly, and this is the apocryphal, this is the legend that goes around among Christians. Constantine had a vision that he was going to win in a battle, and he saw the symbol of Christ, which was the cross, and he changed to being a Christian. Well, that's not true. Constantine was a wild-eyed polytheist, and his army worshipped Mithras, and so he put the symbol, as far as I know, the Pythagorean symbol, which is the symbol of the fish, and so he invited people who worship Mithras and Christos, or whatever they were calling him then. To
I think at that time there wasn't really a division between Mithras and Jesus, and just before those two were what's his name? Starts with an O something.
Osiris?
The Egyptian version.
Osiris.
It's not Osiris. It's the cult that's based on the Osiris myth, and it's kind of it's one of those. It's a later chapter in that section, but I think it's the Serapis. Starts with an S.
Oh,
So
Serapis.
Serapis was a man-made god. He was the Roman emperor put together two theologians, a Greek or a Roman and an Egyptian one. He said, I want you to make a perfect religious system and create one God that we can worship as a empire altogether so that everybody has the same religion. And so they made up Serapis, and Serapis is really similar to what Jesus became, what Jesus and Mithras became. And so what I say in my book is that it's possible, it's within the realm of possibility that the same thing happened later when they're still trying to unite the empire, and the Jews were like one of the rebel people that just wouldn't assimilate, and it's because they had this really foreign religion. And so I can see them taking the Serapis myth that they had made and was very successful in most of the empire, and just what do you call it? Judaizing?
Yeah, making it Jewy. Go ahead.
Making it Jewish. They took the same symbol. They just said they made up Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and they took the same stories and they made it accessible to Jews. And that's why the Jews were like, well, this is garbage. I mean, obviously this is pagan mythology that we're not going to accept. So,
right.
But it caught on anyway. They used it anyway.
But it took a generation of Jews dying out. It took, the sacking of the...
Well, they never really accepted it. But other people, because Judaism had this ancient history and it had these holy books, and they could prove that Moses was 600 years older than everything else. So, and they had all this, the Jews had all this magical stuff too, they were kind of
I call them magical
magi.
Jews. I call them magical Jews before Christ. Elijah, Aaron, Moses. Go.
Right. So they have an older tradition. So for the Gentiles, for the pagans, they have this dying, resurrecting pagan god that they're used to, but now they have this, foreign, ancient, magical Jewish version of it. So it's like the perfect religion. And Constantine, he just wanted one religion that everybody could worship. And the problem with Christianity was some people thought that Jesus wasn't historical. There were a lot of Christians who thought, obviously, Jesus is a myth, that we can interpret the scriptures however we want. This is for us to have a personal spiritual connection with God, but there's not an actual historical human Jesus. And Constantine didn't want that kind of Christianity because that meant that there was no authority. And so he chose the type of Christianity that had a very limited view of Jesus, where he was just a man, so that there could be a very specific chain of transmission. Because if there wasn't a historical Jesus, the problem was Jesus can just show up anywhere as a spiritual entity and give a new, and that's what was happening. Like every 5 years, someone would just say, oh, Jesus came to me and he said this, and there's a new book, and there was no stopping it. So there needed to be one historical Jesus figure so that the people in charge could say, this is the chain of transmission. This is the only thing Jesus said, and then he was gone, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and that point can't be made better, and I just want to hammer it down a little for people. The notion of the Christos, this Messiah figure, all of these ideas that existed over and over and over and over again, and as Derek just said, the story of Jesus happened over and over again. Paul, or maybe Apollonius of Tyana, or whoever you think who these people were, had their own visions and versions of Jesus's. As Richard Carrier points out, there was essentially a Jesus who was born in space, fought the devil, died, and was reborn in space near the moon. Transformers 1, 2, 3, and 4. How many times can you kill Optimus Prime? As many as people will buy tickets for. That's storytelling. You know, how many times can you come up with a new way to sell Spider-Man? As many as people will buy tickets for.
That's what I think is really interesting about our contemporary mythologies, because previously, like those kind of stories, those superhuman stories, even like Superman, you know, he's an obvious good guy, Jesus type character, but in the last 5 or 10 years, all of our heroes have been traditionally evil characters who are misunderstood villains. So we have vampires and we have werewolves and we have even Frankenstein is being retold. They take monsters and they show them as sympathetic, and that's the new storytelling, which I think is fascinating, because there's still this big controversy with Paradise Lost whether Satan is a sympathetic hero who's being, you know, unfairly punished. Anyway, it's a big controversy, but there's a lot of stuff. They were going to make a Paradise Lost movie. They keep trying to make it, but they can't actually make it because there's no way to tell the Paradise Lost story and not make Satan the hero, and they just can't do it because in that version of the story, the literary names are actually God and Satan, and you can't tell that story because people won't accept it. But you can call him Dracula, you know, you can call him one of the other villains, and it's the same story. I really liked. There's the animated version of what's his name? Something Sam. Knock It Down Sam or Smash It Sam or something. He goes around. He's a video game.
Oh, Wreck-It Ralph.
Bad guy. Yeah. Wreck-It Ralph. Oh, that's what it was. Wreck-It Ralph. Yeah, it's basically the Paradise Lost story. Like exactly.
Wreck-It Ralph is the Paradise Lost story. Go ahead.
Yep. He's a bad guy. In his story, he's the bad guy. He can't get out. Everybody hates him. The hero hates him. He's written into this role he can't escape. And so there's this support group of bad guys that he goes to, and he's complaining about it, and all the other bad guys are like, well, you know, that's our role. What are we going to do? And so Wreck-It Ralph finds a new story. He escapes to this other land where he doesn't have a predestined role scripted out for him, and he becomes the hero of that story by changing everything and kind of revolutionizing that other system. In that other system he goes to, it's a lot like a garden story where there's this little man who controls everything. All the races are fixed. It's the racing game, and all the races are fixed, and there's a little girl who wants to win, but she can't win because she's also scripted as the bad girl, the poor girl who can't win. So Wreck-It Ralph he flips these fixed dichotomies of right and wrong, and he creates this space where he can be free and he can write his own moral system. It's exactly what Satan is trying to do in Paradise Lost.
And then we have this interesting chapter, Meeting Satan Again. Draco and the creation mythologies. Now, of course, Draco is the little weaselly bastard in Harry Potter. The evil kid who is tormented by his own evil and confused by it, but evil nonetheless. And
it's interesting also that, like, Vlad the Impaler is called Draco. Draco is always, I mean, the dragon is the symbol of evil, the serpent, the dragon. And so you have, I think, Saint Michael, whose symbol is like killing the dragon. He's always standing on top of the dragon. I think it's Saint Michael, one of the angels.
Saint something in the dragon. It'll come to us.
Jerome? No, I don't remember.
That's one of them. Yeah.
Anyway, you have, I mean, Draco is like the symbol for evil, but the reason it's a symbol for evil is because Draco's the constellation that's centered on where the polar star used to be, where the North Star was. So in the whole night sky, the whole sky spins around, and all the planets move, and all the stars kind of spin everywhere, but the center of the sky is the constellation Draco. So it looks like, and he's this little S-shaped constellation that doesn't go anywhere. He just spins around in a circle in like the middle of the sky. And so there's all these myths about how the dragon created the world by spitting out milk, or somebody cut the dragon in half, or somebody pinned the dragon to the center of the sky so he would spin around. There's all these myths that are really literally telling you what's happening in the sky. It's astrological. You can see it. And I think I've never really heard it said before I wrote my book, and I'm really surprised by that because it's just um, it's not. I don't think it's a leap. I don't think it's like a deduction. I think all these myths are really talking about a real astronomical event that's very measurable. And
Here, let me give a quote from your book. The spinning Draco, the symbol in the sky near the did you say the North or the Pole Star?
the North, yeah.
The spinning Draco may also have been the inspiration for two of humanity's oldest spiritual symbols: the swastika, which unfortunately our Austrian friend hijacked, and not really a friend, and the yin yang. And the yin yang is, of course, the ancient symbol of the intertwining. It looks like fish with, little points in each other. Like Draco completes this full revolution every 24 hours, which, given its shape, would appear as a cross with its arms bent at right angles if depicted in 8-hour increments. A spiritual symbol since prehistory, the equal armed cross with arms at right angles is still considered holy by Hindus, Jainists, and Buddhists, or Jainists and Buddhists. In Hinduism, the right hand clockwise swastika is a symbol of the sun and the god Vishnu. And as a side note, the god Vishnu is the preserver of the universe. And they have a creator, Brahma, who dreams the universe, and a destroyer, Shiva, which is very interesting because Shiva is in no way Satan. They have a very different concept that creation and destruction go hand in hand, and then you have a middle in which you hold on, and then it goes. While the left-hand counterclockwise swastika represents Kali, and Kali is I think a goddess of death and destruction and magic. The Buddhist swastika is almost always clockwise, while the swastika adopted by the Nazis, many of whom had occult interest, is counterclockwise. The swastika symbolizes prosperity and well-being, but also represents the wheel of time. In Chinese star maps, such as the one found in this ancient tortoise shell below in your imagery, the center symbol is indistinguishable from Draco. So,
That's what's really interesting about being in Taiwan. I was doing all this stuff when I was in Taiwan. In Taiwan, you see little jade pendants that's just the yin yang symbol, but it's really just like a S shape with these two dots. And then you see big star maps, which are like a big jade disc with the constellations, like the 12 zodiac animals spinning around. And in the very center, they'll either have a yin yang symbol or they'll have a dragon and a phoenix that are chasing each other around. So then you get all these myths about like a flying dragon. In the West, dragons always fly. We have dragons that have wings and they fly. In China, it's just a snake and a phoenix that are chasing each other. But anyway, so you have up and down. You have snakes because they're underground and birds because they're on high. So like in Roman times, you have the eagle who's carrying the snake. That's the Roman version of the dragon, the flying dragon. Yeah, it's a really universal symbol.
It is. And you talk about Ouroboros, the symbol of the eternity, the snake, the dragon that eats its tail, and then you're looking at that Draco, that North Star again, spinning around in the heavens. A perspective from plasma cosmology or plasma physics tells you that all of outer space is electromagnetic, and that these plasma emanations look like many of the figures that came down through mythology. That may be something for you to look into in the future, because you can actually, you get a different sense of dragons when you see what happens with plasma discharge. And you can repeat it in the laboratory with a plasma gun and an electromagnetic sphere. You can make the rings of Saturn and the polar aurora borealis happen just by shooting charged particles at an electromagnetic sphere. So all of these astrological symbols, they're distant stars, but some of them may have been just regular interplay of stuff in the heavens. Different story, different time. This is Liam Sheff. I'm on with Derek Murphy, author of Jesus, Potter, Harry, Christ. Derek, what do you want to leave the audience? I want the audience to go out and buy, so I'm hoping that you will make some of these chapters available.
Yeah, I will do, because it's a good idea. And talking about all this really makes me excited about working on my next book, too, because all the Wreck-It Ralph, and there's so much more that I have researched that is just nowhere, so I need to put it all together in another book.
Well, I agree. This book is excellent. I mean, I know it has a whimsical title, and people may not know what to make of that. Are you just telling the Harry Potter story? No, you're not. You spend, frankly, very little time.
Yeah, the title is just, I mean, I was already researching this stuff anyway, and I happen to be a Harry Potter fan, and I noticed it's interesting because there's this big Christian controversy over Harry Potter, whether he was basically in the beginning he was worshiping magic because he's a hero for kids that's a magician, and that was evil because the Bible tells us to kill anybody who does magic. But by the end of the seventh book, Jesus Potter sort of dies and resurrects, and he has a lot of similarities with Jesus. So some Christians were writing books saying Harry Potter is a Christian figure, and J.K. Rowling made it to be a Christian narrative, just like, what's the other one? The wardrobe one?
The terrible C.S. Lewis stuff, yeah.
Right, that stuff. So there's this huge flip.
Yes, I said terrible.
Controversy, and then there was this embracing of him, and I just thought it's a good way to lead into this story because obviously we know that Harry Potter is made up and that it's all mythical because we know who wrote it. And if there's these similarities between Harry Potter and Jesus, we assume that J.K. Rowling borrowed from Jesus because Jesus came first. So in the rest of the book, I show how all these other stories came before Jesus, and the rational conclusion is that Jesus' writers borrowed from those stories in the same way that J.K. Rowling borrowed from the Christian story. But
because
anyway,
that's what we do.
Yeah, it was a good lead-in. I would have done it differently. I did fairly well. I pushed it really hard. I got a lot of good reviews from a lot of people, but I think I had to work a lot harder than I would have if I had just picked a different title, something more obvious.
Well, I think that your book is so rich with truly resilient academic detail that people can take to the best dinner parties or university soirees, and yet I find it accessible to read. And you're not afraid of esoteric. You're not afraid of the astrological argument. You're not avoiding it. You're also not saying it's everything. You're saying that there is time, and there's a way that we tell stories, and that stories change. They adapt to their environments. If I inherit a story, I'm going to tell it differently than the way it was told to me, because my life was a little different, and my environment's a little different. So when J.J. Abrams ruins another, the Star Wars series, like he ruined Star Trek, they'll ruin it differently than George Lucas ruined it. They'll have a different spin.
Because it also has to appeal to the new, it's commercial. It's got to appeal to the people who are living now who are going to support it and buy it. Because for the same way, if you were a priest or if you were a storyteller, that's your living. It's got to appeal to the people or nobody's going to listen to you.
Well, speaking of people listening, hopefully everybody's listening to Derek Murphy, and they'll go out and they'll find his author page on Amazon.com. It is Derek, D-E-R-E-K, Murphy, as it's usually spelled, M-U-R-P-H-Y. And do you have a website?
Holyblasphemy.net is the website I have for this type of stuff.
Holyblasphemy.net. Derek, I want to thank you for coming on. I look forward to talking with you again anytime.
Sure, thanks a lot.
And that's it. You are free to go about your business. If you enjoyed the show, please do support it by buying a book, Visual Stories, or by donating a little to PayPal. Find Derek Murphy's work on the web. Find Ken Humphreys at JesusNeverExisted.com. Support his work by buying his book. Please share this show, share this information with your friends, people who may have good reason to doubt that everything they learned about in school is true. Don't try to convert the truly hard-bitten. Just, go to the open-minded people who've already had a little life experience that tells them that people who are in charge make up stories, and those stories are never quite accurate. In fact, they're hardly ever true at all. I will be writing my new book, American Heretic, a little bit out loud. I'll be publishing some of it on the web. I'll be looking for nice web pages to host a couple of the chapters, to give you an idea of where it's headed. It's personal and off the cuff and honest and honorable and all the things that you've come to expect, and mouthy and disgraceful and blasphemous. So we'll see you there. Thanks very much, and see you next week. Remember, share the show with a friend.